Global Higher Education, the Future of Ideas, which is, in a way, a very grand title, Miguel, I think, but one that's, I think, absolutely appropriate that the Global Governance Programme here at the EUI should be thinking about higher education as part of global governance, higher education, what's happening in higher education, the internationalization, the globalization of higher education. And it's something that we have been thinking about, unsurprisingly, I guess, at the EUI. And certainly during my short time as president of the EUI so far, it's something which I've come to feel is a very important part of what we should be thinking about and what we should be addressing, where the kinds of issues which are going to be talked about in this seminar are issues which for the EUI are very important. Issues of mobility, issues of ranking, the impact of internationalization. We are, of course, mobility, I suppose, is rather obvious for the EUI. We are almost by definition a group of mobile academics and mobile researchers. We're producing, if you like, in our doctoral and postdoctoral programs, academics who are very likely to be mobile in their careers. They're very likely, statistically likely, to end up in careers in jobs outside their home country, their state of origin, and that's an important part of the way that we think about education. And they're going to be increasingly teaching in institutions which themselves are internationalized, so they'll be teaching populations of students who are mobile themselves. And that will affect the way in which they teach and in the way in which they think about teaching. So for us and the thinking that we're doing about our own teaching of our own students, our own researchers, doctoral and postdoctoral researchers, this question of mobility is of course, central. But I think the question, the issue of ranking, which will be addressed tomorrow, is also very important to us, and it's something we've had to think about, because actually we find it almost impossible to find a ranking for the EUI. And Andreas, there, our head of academic service, has done a very good job of trying to find rankings for our departments in different media, different places, different types of ranking, but it's not easy. We don't fit into the standard national rankings or even international rankings. We're a social sciences university, we're only a doctoral university, we're denationalized, and for all these kinds of reasons, we don't fit very easily in even the imperfect ranking systems, and they are very imperfect, of course, which exist. So the question of ranking in a world where everyone works on rankings, right? So you're expected to be able to produce rankings to justify what you're doing. It's an interesting challenge for us. So I think that the topics on the table are absolutely pertinent, not only in general terms, but also for the European University Institute. So I'm very happy to welcome you all, to welcome in particular Ben Wildavsky and Ben Hammersley, the two Bens, who are going to be speaking this afternoon, but also all the speakers who are here for tomorrow's session as well. And I'm going to leave it at that and hand over to Miguel.
Thank you, and I'll give the floor now to Ben Wildavsky. He's a journalist of training, I believe, and he's been a journalist for some years. He's now a fellow at Brookings Institute, but he's one of the persons that has conducted some of the more interesting research recently on the process of globalization of higher education, and in particularly a very, I'll say, extremely successful book called the the brain race, the great brain, and he's going to talk us about it. Thank you very much, Ben.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Maduro, for that kind introduction, and thank you also for Professor Carmona for hosting me this afternoon. It's really a great pleasure to be here in Florence, where I haven't been since I think I was a student staying in the youth hostel when I was 22 or 23 years old, and just after 24 hours I can't get over what a fantastic city and what a fantastic setting it is. Now, when I first asked Miguel how I could grab the attention of a very serious and sophisticated European audience here in one of the world's great cultural centers, he said, you really can't miss with a picture of cute animals. So I wanted to show you some monkeys that I came across a few years ago when I was visiting India. This is a photograph that I took from my balcony in Southeast India. And as you can see, they're pretty adorable little creatures. But I discovered that if you leave the guest house and you leave your windows open, these monkeys will come inside and they'll trash the place. So things are not always what they seem. And that's true in other ways as well. You know, to my Western eyes, this seemed like a pretty sleepy, out-of-the-way place. Not only are there monkeys, but there are these beautiful banyan trees everywhere. There are deer running through the forest. This is on the edge of a national park. But it turns out these monkeys are in the middle of the campus of the Indian Institute of Technology at Madras, which is part of an elite network of engineering schools that's sometimes known as the MIT of India. And you know, despite appearances, this out-of-the-way campus is very much at the center of the global network of knowledge and talent mobility that marks the new global higher education marketplace. It's a campus where you go to visit the director and you find out he's just back from Davos, where he's taken part in a higher education working group led by Rick Levin, the president, now the outgoing president of Yale. It's a campus where you go to sign up for job interviews with Google and McKinsey. It's a campus where you see posters advertising postgraduate fellowships at KAUST, the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, which, as many of you know, is a brand new university in Saudi Arabia. Their goal is to attract the best and brightest students from all over the world, so naturally they go to a place like the IITs. As I was working on my book, The Great Brain Race, I came across unexpected and fascinating scenes like this all over the world. But the truth is, I was expecting to write a completely different book. What I sort of had in mind was a series of profiles of the great universities of the world. And as I started traveling around, you know, I realized, you know, that might have been a good book. But I started wondering, you know, why was a university president in India going to Davos? Why were places like Google and KAUST recruiting at the IIT Madras? And I realized that with my initial idea, I was missing a much more important story, which I gradually tried to piece together in the book. And it's a story about how the old order of elite universities is very gradually being shaken up as we enter an era of intense global competition. Now, today, I'm going to give you just a taste of what I discovered. And I'm going to focus on three of the hallmarks of this new global academic marketplace. The first is academic mobility, which we already heard about a little bit. The second is the emergence of university rankings all over the world. And the third is the quest everywhere to create world-class institutions. Now, for each of these phenomena, I'm going to spell out all the intriguing things that are happening and how they've contributed to making higher education globalization reach further and move more quickly than ever before in history. I'm also going to discuss in each of these three cases how some people are wondering whether certain aspects of this global academic marketplace might constitute a threat. But for each of these big three trends, I'm going to try to tell you how we should answer these concerns, why people shouldn't worry, why this transformation of global higher education is a huge opportunity, an opportunity for nurturing talent, an opportunity for fostering meritocracy, and also for fostering innovation, both for the West and for the rest of the world. So let's talk about mobility. What's happening here? Well, as I started to say, we're witnessing mobility of students and also faculty to a degree that's never before been seen in history. Now, of course, we've always had international student mobility in the Western world, going back to the first Western universities in the Middle Ages. You had students traveling from places like Paris and Oxford to Bologna. You had this tradition of the wandering scholar. And of course, that's always been there, but it's been there at a very small level. Now, today, we have more than 4 million students traveling outside their home countries to study. And of course, the EUI is just one place among many where this is happening. And that 4 million represents a doubling, a 100% increase in just the past decade. Now, of course, we'll have an interesting discussion, I think, with my colleague Uta about the question of student populations overall, of course, have grown very significantly as well. But I think nevertheless, these numbers, I think, really matter. And they matter both to the countries that are sending, and I think they matter to the countries that are receiving. There's a projection that will be about 8 million mobile students by 2025. So the numbers have just continued to grow. And of course, among faculty, too, there's significant mobility. It's a little bit harder to get precise numbers, but one study, for example, found that half the top physicists in the world no longer work in their home countries. And of course, when you think about students, it's probably not surprising that there's very fierce recruiting going on to try and capture the best students. At the PhD level, we know in science, for example, that postdoctoral students really form the backbone of the research enterprise around the world. A top student can really write his or her ticket anywhere in the world. At the same time, we know that undergraduates are very sought after as well. And of course, in places like the UK, Australia, the undergraduates pay full fees, and therefore they're very attractive financially. But I think that's, unfortunately, people tend to be, I think, too cynical about these undergraduates and to view them solely as what we call in the United States cash cows. I think that any university leader, any government official who's being thoughtful about the importance of human capital understands that these students are really a source of talent as well, both during their time on campus and when they're able to stay on afterward, if they're able to stay on afterward. Now, as everybody knows, of course, these days, anybody who's in university administration and admissions and recruiting knows the importance of social media when you're trying to get students. And of course, this is something New Zealand realized quite early. About 5 years ago, they created a viral video aimed at the Asian student market. And, they were trying to use social media. They put this out, and it quickly got a lot of attention. I'll just show you a quick still. I'm sorry, that's global student mobility. And now I'll talk about New Zealand. Okay, so this is a still from the New Zealand video that went out on the internet. And if you look carefully, you'll see that it's a shot of a hot tub. It's an Asian couple, sort of smooching in one corner of the hot tub. And you have to imagine the camera pulls back to show the parents not very happy in the corner. And the caption is, "Get further away from your parents." So what's interesting is if you look at the 10-year recruiting figures, you'll see that social media can be very successful because the New Zealand figures, of course, come second only to Korea in the world. So apparently, this kind of advertising is very effective. But look, obviously, this is not all. We're also seeing online mobility of students, and also mobility of instruction. And I'm thinking in particular of the MOOCs that have emerged in the past year. And as some of you know, MOOC stands for Massive Open Online Course. These are these giant courses that have been created mostly by elite universities, places like Stanford, Harvard, MIT. They're attracting massive numbers of international students. One of the first MOOCs was set up by a German guy, Sebastian Thrun, who is a big rock star. He's an engineer. He's the guy behind Google's driverless car project. He's also taught at Stanford for several years. Last year, he and a colleague decided to take their Intro to Artificial Intelligence class. They put it online, and they attracted free, offered to students around the world. They attracted 160,000 students from something like 90 countries. There were more students from Lithuania enrolled in this class than there are students enrolled at Stanford University. So this is a big phenomenon. And I think if we're thinking about mobility in its very broad sense, we have to think about the MOOCs and similar efforts like that as well, which I think we'll probably be hearing more about from Ben later this afternoon. Now, another kind of mobility, of course, is mobility of research. We know there's been an explosion of international collaboration. There's more scientific collaboration. There's been more than a doubling of scientific collaboration across borders just in the past 20 years. And We're seeing mobility of campuses themselves. And when I say mobility of campuses, I'm thinking about the branch campus movement, where campuses mostly in the West are setting up campuses mostly in the Middle East and also in the Far East as well. And there are, at last count, about 200 of these campuses, which is an increase from about 160 5 or 6 years ago. And I'm going to show you one of the Western branch campuses that I visited a few years ago. This is perhaps not what many people think of when they think of the University of Texas, or rather Texas A&M, right? One of the massive universities in Texas with a famously loyal alumni. Well, this is Texas A&M in Qatar. And this is a branch of Texas A&M. It's part of a complex called Education City, which is on the outskirts of Doha. And it includes small campuses from Georgetown University, from Northwestern University, from, from the Medill School of Journalism, that's part of Northwestern, and from several others. There's also a British university there. I think there may be a French university there. And, you know, it's a very interesting place to visit because you go inside, it's very lavish, everything's made of marble, you know, everything's been paid for by the government. You walk up, you see these massive buildings, you see these huge doors open up like the doors of a temple. And then these I saw 3 women in black abayas, you know, come out. And then you walk inside, and then you see the Starbucks, you know, and you see the I don't know what else they have. They have a Subway, they have some fast food places, and then you see the men's prayer room and the women's prayer room and the washing station in between. And then you go into a classroom, and you see men and women studying in the same classroom, which otherwise, believe me, is not happening very much in Qatar. So these are very interesting institutions. And, you know, I think there's a lot one could say about them, but I think the hope of at least some of the universities that are going over there is that they will have some success in spreading what you might call the classic liberal values of Western universities. These include things like open debate, free academic inquiry. The same thing is happening in Abu Dhabi, where New York University has set up a full undergraduate program that's now in its 3rd year, I believe. And, you know, these are very controversial places. They're all often controversial in the country, on the home campus. People worried that, especially when you go to authoritarian societies where there isn't much liberal democracy, you may be betraying the core values of your own university. On the other hand, you know, when I was in Qatar, I saw posters everywhere for a debate series called the Doha Debates. And they're televised, they're on the internet. And the debate resolution when I was there, it said, it was an Oxford-style debate. It said, resolved, this House believes that Gulf Arabs value profits over people. Now, whatever you think about that particular debate resolution, to me that suggested that they're really trying to push the envelope. They're not trying to shrink from controversy. And they're actually, and I talked to some of the Qatari officials who brought in the universities, they're actually trying to encourage more controversy. So I would never overstate, you know, that this is going to have a massive impact instantly, but I think the hope is that over time they may start to push the boundaries a little bit in what have been, unfortunately, very undemocratic societies. So we have all kinds of mobility of students, of faculty, of teaching, of research, of campuses themselves. But there's also a lot of anxiety surrounding this new mobility. And part of that anxiety includes worries about brain drain. And, you know, this is, of course, a worry that's been around for several decades as countries, students from the developing world have gone to the West to study, and oftentimes the worry has been that they'll stay and they won't come back home. Of course, in the West, in a sense, you have the converse concern. In the United States, for instance, that talented foreign students may come in and may crowd out domestic students, may take places that could otherwise have gone to domestic students. And this is what I call, in my book, academic protectionism. And it's something that we've seen in Europe, actually, and Australia quite a lot in recent years. Right now in the United Kingdom, there's been a big problem with the immigration policies, with a very broad brush, making it much harder for foreign students to come in. You've had something very similar in Australia, where there were worries about scams. They tried to crack down. They ended up restricting a lot of students, and the universities were very unhappy, so they've now revisited those policies. Something very similar has happened in France. In the United States, we're having an ongoing debate about visas for students, so-called H-1B visas for talented foreigners that allow you to stay on after you finish studying. And that's been very contentious, and many people, myself included, feel that we don't have enough of these visas, and that we're hurting ourselves because there's lots of talent that could come in. So those are just a couple of examples of the worries people have about student mobility. But I'm going to tell you just briefly why I think we should embrace these developments and why we shouldn't worry about them. And the fundamental thing to understand, as I think certainly people here understand better than in most places, is that we're now in a dynamic higher education world. It's not a static world. The old patterns are changing. So there's no question that brain drain remains a concern in many countries. We're starting to see new patterns. And people are talking now about brain circulation, or you sometimes hear the term the brain train, to capture how different what's going on now is from the old east to west trajectory that we tend to think of. If you look at patterns of study and work, for example, Indians and Chinese, they may come to study in the US or to study in the United Kingdom, but then they may go and get another degree someplace else. They may return to their home country and work for a multinational. So the old patterns are changing. And a great example of brain circulation is a guy named Chun-Fang Shi. Chun-Fang Shi is from Singapore. He went to study in Canada and then at Harvard to get his PhD. He became a very prominent materials scientist, a professor at Brown University. So far, this is the classic trajectory, right? East to west, if you follow that first arrow. But then look at arrow number 2. He gets recruited back to Singapore to work for the National University of Singapore, which is trying to establish itself as a great global university. So he gets recruited all the way back to NUS. So that's already a complete reversal, right? And then there's even a new twist, which is when KAUST opens up a few years ago, they recruit him to become the first president of KAUST. So he goes from Singapore to Saudi Arabia. And look, I would never say that this is a typical example of brain exchange or brain mobility, but I do think that it's emblematic of the kind of patterns that we can start to see in the world that is now developing. And you know, this notion of crowding out domestic students, there really isn't very much evidence of that in the United States. You know, there have been studies showing that in key periods when foreign PhDs were coming into the US, many programs simply expanded. So it wasn't a situation where US students had to be turned away. And you know, I should also note, of course, that talented students who come to the United States are really a huge asset to our innovation economy. In Silicon Valley and many other places. This is something President Obama talked about in a speech last spring. He was speaking in El Paso about immigration policy, and he said, "Today we provide students from around the world with visas to get engineering and computer science degrees at our top universities. But then our laws discourage them from using these skills to start a business or a new industry here in the United States." And he said, "This makes no sense." The bottom line here is that mobility is empowering. As we bring down protectionist barriers, a world of academic mobility lets people get ahead based on what they know, not based on who they are, where they come from. And this is what I call in the book free trade in minds, using the analogy to free trade in goods, in services, other kinds of free trade. And to me, free trade in minds really boils down to the principle of meritocracy, which is hugely important. Well, I've talked about the ways in which a highly mobile worldwide education marketplace has developed. Well, worldwide education markets, like other kinds of markets, need information in order to function. And perhaps inevitably, the mobility of students, of faculty, of research has been accompanied by a real proliferation of college rankings, not just at the national level, but globally. So, what's happening? I'm going to begin with, I think, my favorite rankings slide of all time. This comes from my hometown of Berkeley, California. This is from the University of California's annual yearbook in 1895. It's a little bit hard to read, but I'll explain to you what this is. This is a ranking of physical fitness. And what it shows is they took the measurements, looking at things like the neck measurements, the chest measurements, the ability to lift weights, and they looked at a sample of 15,000 students, a pretty respectable sample, I think in social science, from three of the elite institutions in the East, from Cornell, from Yale, from Amherst, and they compared them with the young men of the University of California, which was then a brand new university, of course, in California, practically on the frontier, and they found that the guys in California were significantly behind the men on the East Coast. And then, after several years of exercises in the brisk Berkeley air, and you can see that beautiful exercise outfits they were wearing, and actually I know what building that is too. It's a great building on campus. After was it 1 year, 2 years? 2 years afterward, they actually exceeded the guys on the East Coast, the blue bloods. And what's wonderful about this, to me, is two things. Number one, this shows you the impulse to sort and to rank is a very old one. It's not something that was invented by U.S. News. It's not something that, that has only been since Shanghai Jiaotong. It's an old impulse. And also, these days, of course, it's very trendy, rightly so, to look at value-added measurement. And this is a sense of value-added, right? It's how much do they improve over time. So it's a great slide. I will skip the history of rankings in the 20th century. It's fascinating. There have been lots of different kinds of rankings. But probably the most significant development was at my former employer in 1983. I was a wee child, but in 1983, U.S. News and World Report, big national magazine, started the U.S. News College Rankings. And part of the idea here was that it allowed a student who might be interested in a university in Delaware, for example, and to compare that with a university in Michigan, to really permit what we would call apples-to-apples comparisons. And of course, since then, rankings have exploded. Both in the United States and all around the world. What many people don't realize, probably you guys do, but there are now more than 40 rankings all over the world, not only, of course, in Italy or in the UK, but in places like Kazakhstan, in places like Nigeria. So rankings have really moved all over. But probably the most significant development in the last decade or so is when rankings really became global. The first significant global ranking was from a Chinese university, Shanghai Jiaotong University, in 2003. The following year, a British publication, Times Higher Education, started its own global rankings, very different methodology, 2004. And ever since, you could probably say there's been an obsession. I should defer to the real rankings experts, but there has really been an obsession with global rankings. And once again, the idea here is that this might allow a student in Singapore to compare a university program in Paris with another program, let's say, in Saudi Arabia. Now, if you look at the most recent rankings, just take a second. You can all look for your, those of you who are a little bit older can look for your undergraduate alma mater on this list. And in a way, these are very familiar names, right? You have Harvard, you have Stanford, you have MIT. Usually in the British list, there's one extra British institution. Don't ask me why, but that seems to be how it always works out. And obviously the traditional elite Western universities are still at the top of these rankings, but I think that you'll find the pattern beginning to change as you go into the top 50 or the top 100. And in fact, already this year, if you look at the rankings, Asian universities improved their rankings in the Times Higher list, and also U.S. universities, although we still occupied 76 out of the top 200 slots, we also slipped a bit in terms of where those universities were ranked. But what I think is really important to consider is that in 50 years, because of the stuff that I'm talking about, I think that these lists could change quite a bit. Maybe not at the top 10, but I think in the top 50, in the top 75, I think that we'll see some shaking up. So, obviously a lot going on with rankings, but once again, there's a lot of worry about the rankings. And, in general, I'll really just sum it up. In general, the criticism of rankings is that they're arbitrary, that they focus on the wrong factors, that they create perverse incentives, and ultimately that they don't really tell you how effective universities are in various respects, including key things like teaching and learning. And if you really hate global rankings, you can just create your own. This is something that came out a few years ago from one of the French institutions, which came up with a whole new methodology, and this was the headline from University World News, which is probably my second favorite ranking slide. So there's a lot of complaints about rankings, but once again, I believe that rankings are ultimately useful. And yes, of course, they have lots of flaws. There are entire conferences devoted to all the flaws of rankings, and I would not disagree with most of them. But I think that we shouldn't lose sight of their potential. And I think they have the potential to help students, to help universities, and to help policymakers with really crucial decisions, because they are all that we have to provide some kind of an external measure, an external yardstick. And they allow us to compare universities, to spur competition, and I think to help universities improve. You know, you could say that rankings have the potential to be, maybe this is a bad analogy this year, the euro of higher education, right? A common currency that lets us all sort of try to look at one another in a similar way. And I think that that's something that we should aspire to. You know, I spoke in England a few years ago at the University of Warwick. I met a woman who was a chemistry doctoral student. She was from South Africa. She got her undergraduate. She wanted to go someplace for her PhD. She knew very little, so she looked at the global rankings, and that gave her some sense of what were some good institutions. Now, that was not her final decision. They were just one point in a whole process. But I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that students as consumers have very little else to go on if they don't have something. And, you know, there's a place you probably know, the Center for the Study of Higher Education in Germany. And I saw the head of this center quoted. And that's a very interesting ranking. It's very different than the Shanghai or the Times Higher. But he said, rankings are a democratic instrument. And again, I think that's right. I think that it's too easy to lose sight of that amid all the criticisms. And I think we also should understand just a very practical thing, which is rankings are here to stay. Rankings are not going to go anywhere. We're in the age of accountability. And it seems to me that, you know, just because you can't measure everything doesn't mean you shouldn't measure anything. So the challenge is going to be to make rankings better. And, you know, I think there are some encouraging efforts going on. You know, I know we'll talk tomorrow about the U Multi-Rank project, which is, you know, something that's just been developed in the last couple of years. There is something out of the OECD called AHELO, the Assessment of Higher Education Learning Outcomes, which I actually think has a lot of promise. And essentially, it's an effort to try to develop an instrument, you know, they're still in the early stages, that can measure student learning across nations. And they're looking at subjects like economics and engineering. They're also doing a test of generic skills, looking at things like writing skills, analytical abilities. What they would like to do, if this goes forward, is to eventually develop value-added measures, which is really, in a way, it's the holy grail of undergraduate education, for example, in the United States. How much do students learn? We don't know. How much do they learn between the time they start university and the time they finish? Can they write better? Are their analytical skills better? Are their economic abilities better? You know, these are very important questions. And so I think we're beginning to move in the direction, at least of thinking about those much more carefully. And I hope ultimately to being able to answer them much more systematically. Well, for all the controversy over global rankings, we know, of course, that many countries are using them in part to assess where they stand in their efforts to build really great universities. And that's my third and probably the most significant trend I'm going to tell you about, which is the race to create world-class universities. Now, why is this happening? You know, I think many countries very correctly see a thriving university system as the pathway to innovation, the pathway to economic growth. You know, there's a quote that I love from two Harvard economists from a book that came out a few years ago. They wrote that human capital embodied in one's people is the most fundamental part of the wealth of nations. And I think country after country is starting to understand this. So, you know, they understand their competition is not just national or regional, that it's global. And they're not happy just to send students overseas or to host branch campuses on their own soil. They want to create their own great institutions. And they want to be able to compete with the best around the world. So there's now intense competition to do this, from China to South Korea to Saudi Arabia. And there's just a lot going on. So let me talk about some of the main things that are happening to create world-class universities. The first is spending to become more competitive. Money really matters. Now, China has not only quintupled the number of students starting university each year in the last decade, they've also spent billions of dollars to expand and to improve their top universities. They want to become a serious player. In Saudi Arabia, King Abdullah put $10 billion of his own money, that's billion with a B, to create KAUST, which meant that instantly KAUST had the 6th highest university endowment in the world. You know, a lot of countries are not only spending, but they're changing how they spend. You know, they're trying to spend in much more targeted ways. They're moving away from the egalitarian ethos that, you know, many feel, I feel, has been a huge problem in trying to maintain excellence. They're trying to reward good work instead. So in places like Germany, you have the Excellence Initiative, of course, which has been controversial, but which is also trying to basically have a much more competitive system of funding. In France, there was Operation Campus, and then there was the big loan. Again, efforts to try to move away from an egalitarian funding system to a much more targeted system. So spending is really important. So is recruiting. This is a big thing that China has done in trying to create really good universities, and they're recruiting overseas Chinese who've been trained in the West to try and get them to come back to China, where the economic conditions are much more favorable than they used to be, where universities are spending a lot of money so they can pay them a lot more than they used to, and they call them sea turtles, which is a wonderful term, but I don't speak Chinese, but a sea turtle apparently is a homonym for a returnee, somebody who comes home. So the sea turtles, the images of them sort of swimming like turtles all the way back home to China. And I think they're having some success, not perfect, but they're having some success. The third thing people are doing is creating partnerships to become more competitive. And Singapore is a great example of this. You know, they're building alliances with top universities. They want to become a global academic hub, and they're bringing in lots of foreign universities, places like Carnegie Mellon, the University of Chicago Business School, Duke University has a medical school in Singapore. Now Yale University, we were talking about this last night, Yale University is creating an undergraduate campus within the National University of Singapore. They're going to call it Yale NUS College. And that's actually significant for, I think, a related reason, which is a lot of places admire us in the West, particularly, I have to say, the United States, because of the undergraduate liberal arts tradition. And whereas we tend to admire the Asian universities for their prowess and the students for being very good at math and science, the so-called STEM subjects, they look at us and I think they admire us for creating students who, at the best institutions, are able to think and to question and to be analytical. And so they look at our creativity as a very important aspect of our success in innovation and trying to create, you know, the Googles and so forth of the future. So Yale is now doing some small project in Singapore, and I would say this is part of Singapore's broader effort. You know, it's very hard if you're a university and you want to just become great like this. You need to have partners. You need to work with other people, and it doesn't have to be completely one way. There may be things you can contribute to them as well. But I think these are all very important. But once again, this world-class university movement, which, you know, you hear an awful lot, especially if you go around to conferences around the world, everyone's talking about it, but it's also causing a lot of anxiety, just like college rankings, just like student mobility. And I think the core concern, you know, in the West in general, and I would say in the United States in particular, is that we're losing our edge, that we're not going to be number one anymore. And, you know, I think when it comes to Chinese and Asian countries in general, it's become very common in the United States to sort of fret, or in the worst cases to panic about, you know, the enormous number of PhDs in science and technology these countries are producing. And it's actually something that President Obama alluded to, unfortunately, in his State of the Union address last year. He said we're in a Sputnik moment. And in the United States, the Sputnik moment has a lot of resonance. You know, this idea that there may be sort of sinister foreign powers that are sort of looming out there we have to be careful about, that there's too much competition. And, you know, in a similar vein, Ian Gow, who's a British academic who was the founding president of the University of Nottingham in Ningbo, one of the first branch campuses. He was in the newspaper some 4 or 5 years ago, and he was quoted as saying that China's partnerships with British universities are a one-way street, that they're intended to sort of vacuum up Western science and technology knowledge that China is really desperate to gain. And he was quoted as saying, British institutions must stop viewing this aggressively ambitious country through rose-tinted spectacles. So if others are getting ahead, this reasoning goes, we must be falling behind. Well, the good news, in my view, is this kind of alarmism is really very badly misplaced. And yes, of course, it's true that Western institutions are beginning to get a run for their money. But I really believe firmly that we should embrace the global academic marketplace because increasing knowledge is not a zero-sum game. Knowledge isn't a finite resource like gold or diamonds that everyone sort of has to scramble over to get their fair share. It's something that can grow. So this apprehensive response that we sometimes hear to university globalization is really misguided. I think it amounts to a kind of modern-day mercantilism. This outmoded idea that in order to prosper, a country has to grab the maximum possible share of a finite amount of capital. And of course, nothing could be further from the truth. Here's a great example of how our store of knowledge can grow. This is a measure of science publications. It's from a UNESCO report that came out about 2 years ago. And although it doesn't show this on the chart, the report found that the American share of global science publications declined between 2002 and 2008, more than any other country. Meantime, China's market share more than doubled. So that sounds really bad for the United States, right? But the thing that you can see here is that the overall number of scientific publications, it grew so much, it grew by more than a third from 2002 to 2008, that American researchers actually published 46,000 more scientific papers in this period, 46,000. So in other words, the research pie is getting bigger. So increasing knowledge is not a zero-sum game, and what's more, knowledge is a public good, and it can't be contained within one country. And that's great, because it means that research advances in one country can be used by academics and by innovators all around the world. I'm going to use an example from the author Amar Bide, who wrote a book called The Venturesome Economy a few years ago, which I recommend. And here's what he wrote. A Briton invented the protocols of the World Wide Web in a lab in Switzerland. A Swede and a Dane in Tallinn, Estonia, started Skype. How did the foreign origins of these inventions hurt the US economy? So when we in the West hear about all these smart people in China who are earning PhDs in all these crucial subjects, we should understand this is good for us. It's not bad for us. We really need more well-trained minds, whatever their nationality, to take on all the big problems in science and technology and healthcare. It's not a matter of vacuuming up knowledge, it's about spreading knowledge. I've talked about several aspects of the Great Brain Race. Huge increases in global mobility of students and professors and knowledge, the emergence of global rankings, and the quest, the race, to create world-class universities. Here's what I want to leave you with. As we look to the future of global higher education, this entire us versus them paradigm of global university competition is increasingly out of date. We already have research collaborations. We have all kinds of partnerships across borders. The MOOCs that I talked about could create entirely new blended models where students may have face-to-face tutorials in one country, and they may watch lectures by famous professors in another country. In 50 years, we could see outright mergers of universities. We could see university versions of multinationals. John Sexton, the president of New York University, talks about the idea of a global network university, where students might start their studies, say in Abu Dhabi. They might spend a year in Shanghai, where NYU is opening a campus. They might finish their studies in New York City, NYU's headquarters. We just don't know what's going to be around the corner. Remember, in the 19th century, Americans flocked to Germany when you had the creation of the Humboldtian Research University, the first research university. And Americans went to Germany, they took that model, they stole it, they came back to the United States, and they created places like Johns Hopkins University, the University of Chicago. And by the time World War II passed, we perfected this concept, and we created the best universities in the world. Because, despite the competition, despite everything I've talked about, that's certainly, I think, I'm not being chauvinistic, but I think it's true. America clearly still has great universities. And now, again, I mean, Uta can tell us more, but I think that when Germany is trying to figure out some different models for its own university system, the American model is something that's been very appealing to a bunch of people. So in a sense, there's at least some Germans who, 150 years later, would like to copy the United States. So things can change. But one thing that won't change, I believe, is that the key to innovation and the key to economic growth in the future is going to continue to lie in the freest possible movement of people and ideas, both on university campuses and beyond. Just one final anecdote that has sort of stuck with me. I visited the University of Wisconsin last year, and I picked up a campus magazine that had an interview with a student. Her name was Mandy Chan. And they asked her whether she would go back home to China after she graduated. And, she said, well, it's possible. She was studying computer science. The industry was picking up there, But the quote that really grabbed me was this. She said, wherever there is an opportunity is where I will be. And to me, that really sums it up. It's a very exciting time, and I'm really interested to see what happens next. So thank you.
So we have some time for some questions and some debate. Who wants to start? Sure.
Well, thank you very much, Ben. That was very, very, very exciting. And I think I agree with nearly everything you said. Maybe except for one or two things. Well, this is how we usually do it, don't we? And I'm sure you appreciate this. During I think it was last year, you may have heard of this, during a recent meeting of about, I forgot, I think 200 or 250 university presidents from all over the world in Chicago, a prediction was created by using their intelligence, joint intelligence, about what the future of higher education worldwide would look like, very much along the lines that you just described. Except for one thing. They said, well, they cannot predict the future, of course, either, and neither can we. But they said the following. They said, well, there will be probably, as we see it, we university presidents from all over the world, about 50 to 100 maximum standalone, highly resourced, comprehensive, research-intensive universities, the big ones. You would perhaps call them the world-class universities. There would be around 100 to 200 networks of global networks of universities working together, as you just described. There would be maybe 100 to 200 specialized institutions in the arts, in engineering, and what have you. And the rest of the 20,000 universities in the world would be regionally related, would be mainly regional institutions focused on their regional or national environments, creating human capital for their regional environments. So the question, I guess, is, not only are we interested in these 500, let it be 1,000 universities that are going to be global players, but there are another 19,000 or perhaps even more that have different roles to play or will play different roles, and their roles are mainly to help develop the national and regional societies and economies where they are related to. And that, I think, is something that we need to address as well. Not only should we focus, and you're absolutely right in many of these things, on what is going on a world scale with respect to the great brain race, we also have to focus on what higher education institutions with different profiles, with different capacities could do for their regional, national context, environments. And what they can do there is, of course, create human capital, create new knowledge in order to create new business and industry and economic growth. And I think if there is anything that we should be worried about in addition to what is happening in the world these days with respect to, let's say, our shrinking economic growth here and there, is that perhaps we do not have enough possibilities to stimulate these developments of these regional institutions. If they are all trying to imitate the Stanfords, the Harvards, the Oxfords and the Cambridges of this world, we will not have the right institutions. These 19,000 will be the wrong institutions.
One. Where do I? Yes, I mean, look, I'll be brief because I want to hear more questions. But of course, I think that's absolutely right. I think that there's also a sort of growing. I mean, I don't think any of these issues will be either or. I think it's both and. So certainly this is true domestically in the U.S. We tend to focus. Every newspaper article is about where the journalist's kid wants to go to college, which is selective. Colleges on the East Coast, which is not where most Americans are older, are non-traditional age, are are going to non-selective colleges, and there's a whole different set of policy questions. I guess what I would say is, on the global stage, it's a little more complicated, right? Because it may simply be that the imperative to have global networks, it's not a prejudice, but it may simply be true. If you are an elite, European University Institute has to have a global network. It seems to me to be successful. If you are, Tennessee State University, it might be nice to have some global, networks, but it's particularly your function to try to effectively teach undergraduates. And, I'm not saying there's no role for globalization, but I think it's a different universe. The only final thing I would say is these questions are going to become, I think, much more murky with the development of MOOCs. Not just MOOCs, any kind of online education, which, by the way, is not just elite students. There are Vietnamese students studying at Australian universities online. You know about that. And there's also the for-profits, which, there's a number of American-based for-profits, Laureate, for example, that are now spreading very quickly in Latin America, among others. And they're not serving elite students, right? It's a global force, right? It's but they're serving, working upper, lower middle class students who are trying to get ahead, who can't get into the elite universities in those countries. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there will be multiple entry points where global opportunities exist, but I don't think that everybody has to be involved to the same level.
So one question is a bit of a follow-up question. Let's assume that there is, as I often say, there is the Champions League of universities, and then there's the other ones, the Europa League or the national championships. But there's those that belong to the Champions Leagues and those. The narrative that you offered us is one where somehow knowledge increases. More people have access to great education too. But on the other hand, that there's greater competition and there's more of an elite kind of more clear differentiation will emerge between real elite institutions and the others, and with greater competition for elite institutions, not only the US but other states that strategically make the choice of we want to invest in having elite institutions in our country. So my question there is that narrative could be seen as promoting two very different phenomena. One is that because more people from all over the world can have access to elite institutions wherever they are, that this will promote a greater equality around the world, that is, in terms of wealth maximization. But another narrative is that the competition between elite universities will lead to stronger even economic differentiation between countries. That in the sense that those that manage are more successful in attracting and having elite universities will grow faster. I mean, there's economic studies that show that the higher, or a very strong correlation between elite university institutions and economic growth and economic development. So which way do you think the process will evolve? You understand my saying? Is it an instrument, is this globalization process with its competitive elements an instrument of greater equality and spread of wealth around the world, or is actually a phenomenon that will lead to even stronger differentiation?
Well, I would say two things. I mean, it seems to me, forgive me for repeating myself, but I don't think it has to be either or. I mean, I think that everybody believes, and they call it massification, everybody believes now in trying to improve education, right? From, European countries to the United States, we have a big push to try to increase the number of graduates, we have a lot of people who start university who don't finish. In India, there's a massive population, terribly underserved, a push for knowledge. Yes, but India, for example, they're not very effective, unfortunately, so far, but they'd like to do both, right? They want to improve access, create mass education much more effectively, and they also want to create, they have even the IITs, frankly, they're good in terms of their student body. They don't do any important research, so they are attacking the problem at different levels simultaneously, okay? And I don't see any reason why, I suppose, yes, there are resource questions always, but I don't think that, competition, I mean, as you can tell, I mean, I believe in the win-win sort of phenomena of free trade, for example. And so I don't think that the fact that different countries are both trying to create an educated workforce at the high level, let's say, or they're trying to create a lot of people who can do nanotechnology, which is one of the sort of trendy things, but it's, it's important if you do it well. So it seems to me that if Australia, and Belgium are racing in nanotechnology, and Australia is worse than Belgium, they're still better than they were 10 years ago, right? So I don't think, maybe I'm not sure if I'm properly understanding your question.
No, that's why it was a follow-up question, but let's assume that that competition leads to having this clear differentiation between 50 to 100 elite universities on the one hand and the rest on the other. One can assume that because of the link that you also established between human capital and economic development, that tends even to increase, that therefore you will also have a strong differentiation between the countries where these elite universities are and the rest. It doesn't mean that you cannot have a better level of life in those other one issue, I mean, that's the same issue as with international trade, is that you can decrease poverty and at the same time increase wealth disparity. So
decrease poverty and increase wealth.
Yes, exactly.
Correct,
Decrease poverty and still increase wealth disparity.
Yes.
Can the same will this lead to the same phenomenon at the education level?
I think that's a very interesting question, and yeah, I think the answer is maybe. But again, I guess I don't. I mean, my view is generally if I don't care so much about absolute differences, or rather relative differences, if people are absolutely doing better. So if the level of mass education goes up, look, there's some countries that are going.
That's why you are American and not European. No,
no, believe me, many Americans disagree with me, but I think. Clearly, this is actually a problem, and I've heard this many times. That there is something of an obsession. The argument goes with elite or with the world-class universities. There are some countries that realistically, I mean, Kazakhstan. Are they really going to have an elite university? Probably not. But they can have one. They can probably have one research university that's respectable. Okay, and that may not be a bad goal.
But my question was not whether it's good or bad.
Will there be disparities?
Whether
yes.
you think it will happen or not.
I think that. There is probably a reasonable chance, but I can't say more.
I don't know if there's... Well, we'll give friends and then...
Just to add, I think for national policymakers, national systems, countries, it might be far more attractive to look at the systems of a diverse group of institutions that are around in a national higher education system, rather than to put all your eggs in the basket of one potential world-class university. Because the system of institution that a country would have, like in Portugal, for instance, would allow you to do much more in terms of economic development and growth than only focusing on one world-class leader in higher education.
Andreas. Mike?
The last thing that Franz was pointing at made me think you are very pessimistic about India, which is very contrary to what we read in the general press and the earth is flat and all that sort of stuff. And when I understand the part of your book on India where you say, no, I don't see great potential because they've concentrated on this one or two institution for this whatever billion or so people, I'm much more optimistic about South America. Could you elaborate a little bit? You didn't say anything about South America.
I did not, but thank you for reading it. I mean, really, at least in the book, I mean, and unfortunately, I sort of ran out of time, so I did, unfortunately, very little with South America and with Africa, which I, regret. In Latin America, I write actually mostly about the role of the for-profits, and the fact that I think state institutions, have not served. In other words, when I say I'm optimistic about South America, it's not because of anything the governments are doing. It's because I think the private sector has at least shown some promise there. India is much more, India is a big, complex country. I just worry about India because I find that actually, I suppose it's true everywhere, I find it upsetting that India has been so incompetent at creating opportunity for education. I mean, it's just, again, the population wants it so desperately. And it doesn't mean, look, they keep on coming up with new plans. It's a kind of a planning mentality. It's a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan. They've actually been very resistant, to bring in foreign universities. and there's been a bill that's languished for several years. It's not that I think foreign universities are the complete solution, but it would be like one element of a creation of a marketplace where if somebody came in and offered classes to students with a respected brand and so forth, they could enroll a lot of students. So I guess I wouldn't say that I draw a huge contrast between one being great and one being terrible, but I think that Latin America has not. I guess I would say it's less dysfunctional. I'm not sure if that's a compliment, but it's less dysfunctional.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll introduce myself as I don't know anyone. So my name is Sasha Perugini. I'm the director of Syracuse University here in Florence. We host an average of 700 undergrad students a year, and we do have a master program. I teach a course on international education. This is my area of research. In particularly, I research on capital development and human resources in study abroad programs and international education. And one of the things that interests me, and I don't know if you touched on this in your book or in your research, is as the numbers of faculty and students grow, and these numbers increase more and more, it seems to me that the legal systems and the let's say you quickly mentioned the immigration problems, the visa systems, and it's not mine. Yeah. It seems to me that the systems that are trying to host the students in the host country are not evolving, are not developing at the same speed that these numbers are growing. So every day as an administrator and manager, I face a lot of problems. We try to attract, or we try to move students more and more, and not just between US and Florence, but beyond these borders. And yes, we face a lot of difficulties and problems. And it seems to me that often senior management at the home universities, whether US, India, China, Australia, are not prepared enough and are not ready to plan strategically for this move. So my question to you is, have you done any research on these specific topics? Have you encountered any specific statistics or studies on these trends?
You're talking about home campuses having done adequate planning for overseas study abroad programs. Are you asking whether there's been research on home campuses doing adequate planning to run overseas study abroad programs?
No, in general, of senior, I've worked for an Australian university before Syracuse, so I'm talking about generally home campuses in any country and the senior management who are planning on opening offshore activities. It seems to me that while these ideas are very ready to be developed, and are very creative at the logistical level, on a day-to-day level, there are still a lot of difficulties.
Well, I'm glad you told me that. To be honest, I'm much more familiar with the sort of strategic planners, the people you talk to, the presidents, the provosts, the heads of international affairs. I mean, they're obsessing about this. I mean, they want to talk about this, a lot. In terms of should they go someplace, where should they go, how should they do it, but I do not know very much about the operational details, I'm sorry. So.
Thank you. Interesting, and we've been in this discussion for a while, for probably a decade or a little bit more, and for that reason I'm always trying to ask myself the question, what's really new? What's new? What's new? Seems to be one thing new to me, relatively new, and that's the role of capital, financial capital. My view, if anything, has changed compared to 10 years ago, because technology is not new, the mobility is not new, the rankings are, well, they went global, okay. But what's really new or different, at least in my view, is where capital is and where it's lacking and where it's flowing to and from. With respect to the countries you talked about in Asia, but also indeed South America, I think we see a very different picture, and it might be so that we can expect public systems to become far more private in terms of funding, or underfunded.
So my question is, how do you see the backing up of this whole development in terms of capital flows, and global imbalances therein?
I'm not sure if I understand the question.
Well, to make it clear, Europe and the US
Yeah.
are on the deficit side, I think.
Right, of course. Well, I mean, I'll speak about the U.S. It seems to me that, notwithstanding, obviously, big financial problems, a very anemic recovery, it doesn't appear to be stopping. Two things. In some places on the receiving end, places like California, which has had massive, as you know, everybody's got budget problems, but the University of California and other state parts of the state system have just had very severe budget problems and cuts, and they have started taking in a lot more foreign students just for the revenue. So that's the sort of cash cow aspect that I was telling you about. But I would say, in terms of in my conversations with university leaders, and I think this would be true of publics as well as privates, there's a very big appetite for doing global initiatives. Now, that doesn't mean people have a lot of money necessarily, but I think people view it as an imperative. So that's not a very specific answer, but I don't think that the pace of universities, having partnerships, of maybe branch campuses are a little iffier, but even then, branch campuses are questionable for lots of reasons. It's a big risk. People are not going to risk a lot of money on that. But I don't see sort of lack of capital. If that's what you mean, I don't see that as having a huge putting on the brakes of this movement, which I think is sort of, maybe some periods will be stronger than others, but I don't think it's going to stop.
Thank you. I have a very short question. It's essentially this: does size matter? You understood?
I think so. I think it depends on what we're talking about. For the biggest
on this race.
I think that not everybody will participate in the same way, right? And not everything that I write about, to be honest, the race is the title, and that's a big theme. But there are smaller places, that are already. There's all kinds of small places that have exchanges that they send students, they receive students, they have faculty exchanges, and so on. If you are going to, there's two answers maybe. If you're going to focus at the department level, let's say you're an Australian university, and University of Western Australia, I'm not positive, but I think they probably have a pretty good marine biology program. Certainly Melbourne probably would. So if you have a great strength in a particular department, at a department level, you can probably be competitive without having it doesn't matter so much how big your university is. But if you're going to try to, certainly in the rankings, multiple strengths in multiple departments at a very high level, then I think it's going to be hard to do that if you're tiny. But is there some threshold between, I don't know, a number of students, 25,000 students versus 50,000 students? I doubt it. There may be some cutoff. At least in the U.S., people don't tend to do very much research when they're smaller institutions. Liberal arts colleges may be great, and they'll be participating in a certain way, but they're not going to be doing, the kind of research that's going to get you a high ranking in the Shanghai rankings.
Last.
Sorry to speak again, so if you want to give it to someone else. I just wanted to answer this, since I recently did a study on size and position in rankings, and what the outcome was the following. Size does matter to some extent, but money matters much more, if you see what I mean. So if you are big but poor, or if you merge two poor institutions, you become big, you still will not go up the ranking ladders very easily. If you're small but you're very rich, you will go up easily. A few examples: the two University of Manchester universities merged, became bigger, became 4 times as rich, went up the ladders easily. Some mergers in Denmark, University of Aarhus became bigger, but became 5 times as rich, went up the ladder of rankings very easily. Now, some institutions are very big, as you know, Tokyo, for instance, or they're even larger, Rome. they have not been able to climb the ladder of ranking easily, although they are very big. So I would assume that size matters, but money matters much more.